And I think this is the case with a lot of people. The deeper and more interior you go, you realize that you're not by yourself in your existence. My name is Father Pier Giorgio. I am a Discalced Carmelite Friar. I live here in our monastery in Washington, D.C.
And are you like right in the city?
Yeah, we're pretty close to, if you go up onto our roof, you can see Washington Monument, you can see the Capitol. We're about a mile north of the Capitol and about 3 miles from the White House. So we're right in the midst of a very busy, just to the rear of our monastery is a 6-lane kind of major artery in the city. So we're in the city. We're living in more of the urban monasticism.
Urban monasticism. What? Yeah. Usually think of monasteries. You're like, wow, in the middle of nowhere and it's quiet, but you're in the middle of the city. Like, why? Why would they look at a monastery here?
So one thing about us that's a little bit different, perhaps to bring in, is that we're not monks in the sense of that sort of monasticism. We're friars, and a friar, that kind of word, that way of life comes from the mendicant movement in the Middle Ages, and where there was just this call to serve the people more readily. Whereas before, monks maybe lived off the land, they lived kind of in more remote areas. The friar, that sort of life was more urban in general. It's not to say that we don't have places that are necessarily in the countryside or in more remote locations, but it is part of the tradition in a sense to be more located closer to the people that we desire to serve and that God has asked us to serve. And so in that sense, there's definitely a use for it and an intentionality behind it, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, what brought you here?
God brought me here.
Yeah, how did you do that?
Well, I mean, it's everybody. There's stories. There's aspects of it that are longer, and there's aspects of it that they're kind of cut to the chase sort of thing. And essentially, God changed my life, and as a response to that change, I felt that He was calling me to live a life in community, in religious life, a life dedicated to prayer. And to serving the people of God. And I came, a lot of my sort of story happens when I was in college, and God kind of broke into my life at a time when I was, there was a lot of pressure for me in terms of performing and pressure to succeed, pressure to do well in school, and in the midst of that, just sort of expectations in relationships and friendships, and there was a lot of, I felt, inauthenticity in my life as a result of that, of trying to conform to maybe other people's ideals of of who I should be, or how I should live in the world and how I should interact with society at large, and I just found myself kind of not being fulfilled in that sort of trajectory. My life wasn't going in a direction that I was excited about, and I was doing pretty well as well. I was the time I was had a kind of a prestigious placement for the summer at the Texas Medical Center, just a huge hospital center doing research, and the context of that was I was living in an empty dorm because it was the summertime by myself, and that was really the first opportunity in my life for a lot of silence and a lot of alone time, and it gave me kind of a space and context for reflection about where I was going, where I'd been, the more recent sort of failures and successes in my life, and even in the context of that success of getting into kind of a prestigious program. I was living at Rice University, a prestigious university. It just wasn't feeling satisfied with that and that success. And in the midst of that kind of introspection, and I think this is the case with a lot of people, the deeper and more interior you go, you realize that you're not by yourself in that, in the being, in your existence. And just the realization that God was with me, that God was that God was directing me, that he was giving me graces and helping me to make decisions, and that he was with me even in those kind of big questions that I was having at that time in my life. And from there, things happened very quickly. From that realization that I wasn't by myself, that I wasn't alone, and who that it was with me was God, who is love, and that's who He is, and love is a relationship. Love is not about just all about me, and so there was a lot of pressure that was taken off of me when I realized that, in the context of Jesus, is the incarnation, Him coming into this world. That takes a lot of pressure off of mankind, because you realize that you're not the protagonist of the story. You're not the one who is. It's not all about you, in a sense, and you fit into a bigger picture of what it is that someone more powerful than you is doing in the world. And that was a huge realization for me, and something that still blows my mind to this day. Of what my life is about. My life is to love. My life is to live with God, who is love, and to share that love with the world.
And how did you reach that realization? Was it like a aha thing? Was it a gradual unfolding? How did that actually happen for you? And I imagine that's also a journey too
of course.
These are mysteries, right? But
yeah, and a lot of that happens kind of in retrospection, right? Looking back, and there's a reason why God gave us a memory, and so that we can see, maybe in those grace moments in our life of looking back and saying, well, maybe it wasn't all for nothing, and maybe there was something that God was doing for me in that moment, even in the moments that I would rather have not have happened in my life, those difficult moments. I think even now, looking back at that summer, which was a very grace-filled summer, I've gained a lot of understanding and unpacked a lot of the mystery of what was going on. I think in the moment it wasn't as clear, and I think it's helpful to keep that in mind, because sometimes you don't always understand what's going on and why it is that you find yourself in a particular situation, and but I think a lot of times, even in those good moments and those difficult moments, nothing is never accidental. There's an aspect that God is directing us. He's bringing us. He's helping us make the next best step, in a sense, in terms of our own discernment of what to do next, or whether it be just trying to solve the problem of getting out of whatever hole that you find yourself in. And I think God is He puts people into our life. He puts people into our path. He gives us ideas in terms of different things. And so just to say that it's not always clear what's going on in those moments, those grace-filled moments, and we may come to realize that later on in life. But it's I mean, the question is how did I get here, in a sense of how did it, like, what happened in the aftermath of all of that. And it's really, life continued, my life continued, my trajectory continued, and I just tried to keep moving forward with the realization that I wasn't by myself and that I didn't have all this pressure anymore. It was very freeing to be able to just to recognize that there was an aspect of which I was in control, but by and large, in the grand scheme of things, providence was what was directing my life, and that providence will continue even after I am not on this earth. My soul is separated from my body, and I move. I die. That story continues, and the protagonist of that story is eternal, and He desires to live with us eternally as well.
And so, at the time, you have the summer at Rice, and there's some transformation that's occurring. What was it like before? Were you into faith stuff? Were you?
Not really.
Okay.
Faith wasn't a big part of my life. I was baptized outside of the church. In childhood, my family had become Catholic, but it was never anything that was foundational in my own sort of understanding of who I was. I had witnessed my mom's conversion to the faith, and so there was definitely some seeds planted in that. in my childhood growing up, just in the sense of as you kids are very perceptive and can pick up a lot of different things, and so I think I was picking up on some of the changes that were going on even in her life and her understanding of who she was, and that was sort of kind of in the back of my mind in terms of the church and faith and things like that. But I wasn't practicing my faith in college. I hadn't finished the sacraments of initiation within the church, and so I was definitely kind of away in that moment from the practice of the faith in terms of going to church and things like that. I just joined a fraternity.
Okay.
And in fact, after that summer, one of the crazy things that happened is I was living in a fraternity house, and I was trying to live two lives essentially. In the one hand, God had changed my life, and I was trying to respond to that call. I was trying to respond to that change in my life. And on the other hand, I still had the same relationships as I had before the summer, and so trying to balance that and trying to maybe make two spaces for those two things was a good learning experience for me, because I realized that maybe there has to be some when God changes your life, he changes your entire life. And in that sense, it's going to change a lot of your relationships. It's going to change. And not to say that we should be afraid of that. And I definitely was. I was afraid of losing certain relationships. I was afraid of losing because, these people who I was friends with, they weren't Christians. They weren't practicing any sort of faith. And so I felt like, well, God is taking these people away from me and changing me and changing my attitude and changing my desires, essentially. There was a lot of fear surrounding that. And that took a long time to move through. But again, at the end of the day, it was that realization that at the center of who we are, at the center of our interiority, is the best friend that you'll ever have. It's the one who created you. He's the one who's always with you, and he's the one who, even when you mess up, is merciful and will help you move through those difficult times.
So you feel like you're living a double life at this point, and did you leave the frat house? Did you cancel your friends, or what? How did you reconcile that tension?
Well, I think what happens for most people when they're living a double life is that it all comes crashing down, and that's what happened to me. I basically failed a bunch of classes that semester.
You were partying too much, or what was going on?
No, I don't think it was because of that. I think it was I was doing too much. I was doing too much, and and the thing that fell out of my priorities was my studies and being in college. So it was sort of like trying to develop a relationship with people at church, as well as trying to live, continuing my relationships with my fraternity brothers. That social life, and it's not to say that my social life caused me to fail my classes. I think it was really just sort of there's a lot going on inside of me, and school was the least of my worries until it became the center of my worries in the sense of failing 3 classes in one semester.
Whoa.
So
you failed the classes, and then you had to drop out. What happened?
No, I went to a small school, so there was a sense in which they weren't going to sort of kick me to the curb. There was a little bit more of a desire to help me,
Gotcha.
And so through the help of administrators and things like that, I was able to get back on my feet and also talking about all this stuff with people. And it was actually in the summertime after all that happened that I was introduced to a lot of for the first time Catholic friends, and I think that was also a big help in sort of framing myself within the context of what was going on in my life at the time, in the sense that maybe these friendships that I have now won't be lasting, but God is going to provide people in a sense, a community for me in order to move forward, and to live the life that he's calling me to. And so I think that was a big help for me as well. There was, after that summer and meeting those people, there was less of that need or that impetus to live 2 lives, in the sense of, okay, I have to have friends, I have to have relationships, I have to have a community of some kind, But at the same time, God has asked me to do something more. And so eventually, God provides, and that community comes, and you enter into it. And then some of that turmoil kind of dissipates in a sense. But
So you, not to boil it down too much, but you go from failing failing school in a frat house to being in a monastery in DC.
yeah.
Can you connect some of the dots there?
Yeah, so there's a lot of dots. There's a lot of
You
dots.
don't have to go through all of them. But...
Well, so when you have a conversion experience, I think there's a desire to do something with it, and I had that desire.
And just to go back, I'm sorry, the conversion experience, was this like a momentary thing, or was it like, it was an instant thing?
I mean, it was June 21st, 2008. I mean, I can point to the exact time,
okay.
so there's a sense in which I can point to a particular moment, where this all happened, and so that's I have that aspect of it, and there was something that kind of maybe a little bit extraordinary that happened in my situation.
Can you share any? I mean, I know it's be careful talking about these things, but is there anything you could share about the recollection of that experience, or what it meant to you, or some aspect of it?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I was working in this laboratory at the Texas Medical Center, and I was working in an all Portuguese speaking lab. And so the only time that anyone would be speaking English was when they were telling me to do something. And so, again, that sort of isolating experience. And so I hated the work. I hated the job. I was always trying to get out of it. And well, anyway, I went to a bookstore after work one day, and I just found myself, as a used bookstore, I found myself in kind of the section where people with a lot of questions end up, and it's the kind of the religion and the philosophy and the self-help, all of that sort of stuff. And the idea of going back to church was something that was kind of in my head, and I knew that my mom and dad were practicing Catholics, and so I didn't know anything about church. Literally, I'd been to Mass before, but I didn't know anything, fundamental about it. So I picked up Catholicism for Dummies.
That was the title of the book?
Yeah, Catholicism for Dummies. It was very appropriate.
Yellow cover and.
Yep. Yeah, and I got to the section really on the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, and that was there was a realization there that, like, oh, this is what I need. This is what I need, and this is why I'm going to become Catholic.
Realization, like a intellectual, is it like, what do you mean by realization?
The idea that Jesus is present in the Eucharist substantially, that he is there, that's Jesus, is something that clicked with me, and there was a realization of I need him, and that tangibility of receiving him in communion was something that there was just a recognition. It's like when you recognize. It's like when you see a woman and you recognize she's the one, even if that has to be purified, obviously, and that had to be purified in me as well, in terms of the understanding of what that is, and the sacraments and the mysteries behind it. And so it was from that realization.
And so just
to overnight. Well, I mean, overnight reading. I read that book in one night. I stayed up all night, and I went to Mass the next morning.
Wow.
And I probably shouldn't have, but I received the Eucharist.
So this is more than just like an intellectual realization, like, oh, 2 + 2 is 4. This sounds like something like existential and extremely deep, like almost an internal knowledge.
Yeah, I think so. There was an intuition of a need, of a desire, and that's why I think for me, in terms of my own conversion, it was akin to falling in love, because you don't always understand kind of what's going on in the midst of that. And I had been in relationships before, but I had never felt anything like that, in a sense the desire to be fulfilled.
Okay. And then so you stay up all night reading this book, go to Mass the next day, and then maybe give us a couple more dots between.
So I years pass by. I'm continuing to practice my faith. I move out of the fraternity house, although I had to move back in because at the end of my senior year, it was 2010, so there was no jobs, and and I had planned on becoming a missionary temporarily for a few years. And evidently, I had applied to a very difficult sort of placement to get into in terms of serving. It was up in Alaska, and it was very kind of it was a cool placement. So there was a lot of competition to kind
For
of get
Alaska,
that. Yeah,
interesting.
and so that fell through. So I was kind of stuck without anything to do. Graduated, and I was going at that point. I was going to be graduating in May, and it was through a very wise priest who recognized. Well, he had been with me through all of this in a way, post conversion, and in those 2 years that because this all happened the summer between my sophomore and junior year, so 2 years kind of in the midst of this, and he recognizes something in me, and he suggests that I go to seminary I mean, the idea when you go to seminary is that you're going to be ordained a priest, but in reality, that's not really the case, because really in terms of the Catholic Church, the seminary is a place for men to more deeply discern what God's doing in their life. And I don't know what the percentages are, but there's a good percentage of men who don't end up being ordained and they leave. But I don't think anyone goes to seminary and says, "Oh, that was a waste of time," right? So I think this priest understood that, and he recognized that there was a space in my life that needed to be filled with something to do, and he thought that I could be called to a priest, and so he invited me to discern that more deeply by entering the seminary and to further that discernment. And so I moved back into the fraternity house for the summer because I needed a place to live, and there was a Monday morning in August that I packed up, moved 9 a.m., moved out of the fraternity house, and by 3 p.m. was moving into my room at the seminary. And so that was a whole nother stage of my life, and growing in the realization of what, kind of things becoming clearer of what exactly God was calling me to. And I think maybe this is one of those things is like you wonder like why God brought you through certain periods of your life. Like why did God bring me to a fraternity house, or what was the purpose of that period of my life? And I think one of the purposes of it was to help me to realize how God wanted me to live the life that He was calling me to in the context of a community. And that was something that had been kind of formed in me as a college student, as a man living in a college fraternity. That kind of so they're not, college fraternities aren't all bad. There's some good to them, and one of those goods I think is that depending on your brothers, and also being depended upon. And so that was something that I think had become a part of me, had been formed in me, and there was sort of a desire to live that for the rest of my life. And so that's how I found religious life, which is a life that is kind of centered around living in community, to the service of the church.
Yeah. So the same day you go from moving from the frat house to the seminary, literally on the same day. And what? Yeah. Okay. So let's fast forward a little bit. Now you're back in the monastery in D.C. Tell me about what? Tell me about a little bit about the way of life here. Like, how would you describe it? What's it like? Give me just maybe walk me through like a typical day here.
So I think you come to a monastery and you have a lot of expectations about what it's going to be like, and to some extent, I mean, we know if you have any experience with the church and monks, and you might have some idea that there's probably a routine in the schedule, and so we do. We have what's called an horarium, which is a set schedule that we follow each and every day. Not every day is the same. Some days are different. There's sometimes in the church in the year that are more celebratory, and so we maybe we loosen some of the structure a little bit for the sake of being able to celebrate with one another a little bit more. There's days and seasons where maybe we want to be more penitential and ascetical and more intentional about tightening that belt a little bit, and so we structure our lives a little bit more closely, and so there's like this kind of inhale exhale sort of imagery going on there, and so the life is really just a shared life of prayer being the foundation of that. We pray together. We pray together probably, depending on the time of year, between 3 and 4 hours a day together, and that kind of frames our day, prayer, and which makes sense because if we understand that the purpose of why we're here is to live intimately with God. I mean, not just in the monastery, but here on earth. God is calling us to some supernatural end, to live with him forever. Then the life in the monastery ought to be centered around developing and forming that relationship with him. And so that's a big intentional part of our life, is prayer, spending time with God in prayer, and also making sacrifices to be able to do that, to make that time.
So that's a cornerstone of it, prayer, and you said 3 to 4 hours a day, and you multiply that times all the years you've been in the monastery. It's thousands of hours in prayer. What advice or encouragement would you have for people that are, either beginning a prayer routine or some stage of that and want to go deeper into it?
I think the most important thing is to make time for it. If you view God as love, and the implication of that is that there's a relationship involved. We believe that God is triune, that he is himself a relationship between three divine persons, that he desires to live that relationship with us. If you view a relationship on the level of various levels of intimacy, maybe one kind of approachable way to look at that would be friendship. If you want to be friends with somebody, you have to spend time with them. And so one thing that I would say is crucial and fundamental is making the time for that relationship, making the time for prayer. And so the foundress of our religious orders was St. Teresa of Avila. And one of the things that she says to people who want to start a life of prayer, want to pray more, is to be determined, because you're going to want to give up, and you're going to fail, and you're going to forget, and you're going to want to do something else. And that's just a part of being human. We're pulled in all sorts of different directions. We have all sorts of priorities in our life, seasons in our life where things take more importance. And so even in the midst of that desire to pray more, you can't see it as something that's always going to be there. And so that was her advice, is that because of who we are, because of our immediacy with different things going on, is that you have to be determined to live a life of prayer, and come back to it. When you fall, you get back up, and there's a tenacity involved with this life, just because we fail, we make mistakes, our priorities change, and so making that time, and then when we fail to make that time, to try again.
Why should I pray? Why should one pray?
Prayer, kind of going back to something that I said previously, it's so one thing that I mentioned was that in life, in the Christian worldview, in life you are not the protagonist of that story. We believe that Jesus is the primary protagonist of the creation of the universe, right? And so if in life we are finding ourselves constantly tempted to make ourselves the protagonist, and that can take many different forms, whether it's I have to get this done, or I have to take care of this, or else X, Y, or Z will fail. My friends will leave me. My wife will leave me. I'll lose my job.
Get kicked out of the frat house.
Get kicked out of the frat house. Fail my classes. All of those things are pulling us to kind of that temptation of making ourselves the center of our story, and prayer is the remedy to that. And so I think that if you find yourself in a position where you're constantly feeling this pressure to perform, to succeed, to fix, to solve, to do all of these things that maybe you don't have the answers to, then prayer becomes that sort of antidote of, it's not about me. It's not about me. And coming, just a second. We haven't had too much of that.
We've had no buzzers, which is amazing. Father Mark's not here.
So prayer is an antidote to that. It's not about forgetting yourself. It's just about remembering that you are not alone, and that God is with you, and that He is a lot stronger than you, and He can do a lot with the very little that you're able to give to Him. That's a central tenet of the Christian faith is the transformation of God, the resurrection from death to life, right? And there's seasons in our life where we feel very dead, and if you want to move through that, then you have to find someone who can resurrect that death, and that's God, and going to Him is prayer.
Saying I don't know how to pray. What would you tell me?
Do you have friends?
I think I do.
Yeah. So if I don't know how to pray, how do I pray? It's again kind of going back to a lot of my understanding of prayer comes from the teachings of our founderess, Saint Teresa. The church has actually named her as kind of the preeminent teacher of prayer. There's 38 saints throughout the history of the church that have been designated as doctors. There might be 37. Somewhere in there, a number of saints that they've declared as doctors of the church, sort of having preeminent teaching. And Saint Teresa is called the doctor of prayer. And it speaks to kind of her expertise in this area of how to pray. And her insight, the reason why she's considered to be top of the list in terms of this subject, is that she just discovered that prayer is just a friendship. Prayer is a relationship with Him who desires to always be with us. And so if you consider your own friendships and relationships and what happens in those things, what you tell people, you tell your friends what's been going on in your life, you tell sometimes I'm so busy in my day, and I go to prayer in the afternoon, and I'm just Jesus and I just need to read a book together, because in terms of my focus and my ability to talk to Him and to be with Him, it's just a matter of, well, let's do something together, and so we read together, usually something edifying and something related to the faith. But I think that with that approach of friendship, prayer becomes less of a method and more of a just being with, and that's it's natural. We know how to do it. We've been doing it our entire lives, being with people. God became man. He became Jesus. He became incarnate in Jesus Christ, and so one of the reasons why we believe that God decided to do that was so that we could relate to Him on the level of friendship, on the level of human relationship. And so prayer is just being alone, being with Him, not alone, being with Him and being quiet and speaking to Him and talking to Him. Sometimes, I use this analogy often with people is that prayer is like a road trip, because maybe your friend picks you up to go on this trip, and for the first hour or two, you're talking, you're catching up. Oh, I listened to this podcast at least recently. It changed my perspective on X, Y, or Z, and what do you think of that? And but I think everyone has this experience that at a certain point you run out of things to talk about, and there's this just sort of, you're driving along, and maybe you're driving through a remote part, and so the radio cuts out, or the reception, your ability to play music cuts out, and so there's just this silence, and it's comfortable. I mean, there's trust in the relationship, right? So there's not awkward. It's that silence. Sometimes in the beginning of a relationship, silence can be awkward, and so it's also to say, if silence is awkward to you in this time of prayer, that to just realize, well, silence can be awkward for new friends, and so not to be afraid of that. To understand that it's going to develop, it's going to get stronger. I'm going to begin to trust this person who I'm with, and I think that can be kind of another helpful sort of way to view prayer, is that sometimes it's very quiet, and that's okay.
I think, you pray 3 or 4 hours a day. I mean, do you think that's needed for most people? Do you think everyone should have some time for prayer every day, or every now and then, or how it, are there practical tips or guidance you'd give to thinking about structuring it into your day or not?
Yeah, I think most people, every individual is going to have kind of a point where it's going to be like, well, I don't have time for that. Well, what do you have time for? And to kind of move backwards in that sense. So God has called me over the course of several years of changing me to live a life that is in the context of giving a lot of time to prayer. And that's not for everybody. And so what is God calling you to? How much time is he calling to? I mean, like I said, God can do a lot with a little. And so even 15 minutes, even bringing it into the context of what you're already doing. Maybe that road trip analogy is helpful, and you can just imagine Jesus riding shotgun, on your way to work, and you can just cut the radio off and be with him then, And I think in our life we have seasons where we have less time for friendships and relationships, and so that's going to change and develop based on what's going on, which is why that idea of when things kind of get away from you to be determined to get back to it.
In the monastery, you have a lot of time for prayer. You talk about what are the other, one or two elements of the monastic life that have been, impactful for you, or that you've, that have stood out for you that you'd like to share about?
So life in a monastery is not a kind of an independent sort of existence that exists outside of what's going on in the world, and I think that's helpful to remember, just because part of our life is well, how can I say this? I don't even know. You were asking. What were you asking?
Different aspects. You want to describe
different aspects of life. So not just the prayer, but okay. Okay, I know where I was going with that. So I think it's important to remember that a monastery isn't some independent existence outside of the context of everything else going on in the world. Part of our day is engaging with the world, and that might be in the context of ministry. That might be in the context of praying for the needs of the world, people who call our phone and ask for prayer, and or people who come asking for help or advice. Some of what we do, a lot of what we do in this particular house, this monastery, is a spiritual direction. So people come in, all walks of life, all ages come, and just to talk about prayer and growing in that relationship, and that's something that we do. We the church has asked us to do, to kind of be accompanying people in the journey, this journey of life and growing interiorly. Something that I do is I am responsible for the English language publishing of the writings of some of our saints. So my 9 to 5, I guess you could say, is probably similar to a lot of people's. I'm on Zoom calls. I'm doing work. I'm editing. I'm translating. I'm at a computer. Answering emails. Too many emails. And so that's spreadsheets, accounting. Those sort of things. You don't run away from those things when you enter the monastery. And so I think just to say that this life isn't the life in a monastery isn't completely different from most people's understanding. I think if you consider, like, most people work ideally 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, so that's kind of your 40-hour work week. You could kind of tricate that, I guess you could say, between 3 8-hour periods in your day, and so 8 hours hopefully for sleep, 8 hours for work, and then in remaining 8 hours for your family, your life, your interests, your hobbies. For me, my interests, my hobbies are the life that goes on here, my life of prayer. But I still have my 8 hours or so. It's probably a little bit less than 8 hours. My 8 hours of work, of the apostolate and working with people. But the other 8 hours are filled with this time of prayer and community. We eat meals together. We have this time together.
I think it's a helpful framework of like the Holy Trinity of a day. Like work, rest, and kind of everything else, which is the community, your
the stuff you
live
for.
Yeah. Well, hopefully living for all of it, right? But yeah, So you talked about working like in spreadsheets and on Zoom calls, and you know, it's probably not that different emails than a lot of than most people that aren't living in monasteries. How is your orientation to, you know, and then you also described before you're kind of like, you know, kind of maybe chasing success or achievement in different ways. How has your relationship to work changed, or how do you think about work now in this context? Even though the work may be similar to what a lot of other people do out there, how do you think about how you work?
I think it's difficult, and I have this temptation as well of like, okay, well, this needs to get done. There's a deadline, and so maybe I have to cut in here and there to get this, to make sure that this gets done by Friday, you know, or something like that.
When you say cut in,
I don't know what I don't know.
you said I sometimes have cut in to make sure it gets done.
Oh well, so sometimes the demands of our work can cut into our plans or our life, our family, our my prayer time, or there can be a temptation for it to cut in, and so you know, we have things like deadlines that we have to, expectations of our jobs or our customers or our clients, and so sometimes we make, well, I'll make a sacrifice here, and so I'll skip prayer today, and I'll just continue working for a little bit, and I think, you know, that's fine, that's okay. From time to time we have to make those sacrifices. There's demands on us that have to be met, and we can't really do anything about that. But if that becomes the norm, if that becomes our life, then we're going to begin to feel it. And similarly, if I make a cut in my life of prayer every day, then my life's going to be changing, and in a way that God's not calling me to live my life. And so there's that sense that of boundaries, and you know, for us, the kind of the preeminent boundary in our life is our schedule. You know, making sure the bell rings, and okay, this can wait. In the grand scheme of things, this can wait. And I might have to say I'm sorry, or I might have to ask for forgiveness, or I might have to you know, need to make some other sacrifice in order for that to happen. But you know, ultimately, those boundaries are kind of what kind of keep one area from kind of you know, moving into another area of priority in our life, our family, our my community, or my relationship with God.
So having those boundaries in place. What about when you're active, you know, those 8 hours a day, or slightly less than 8 hours a day when you are working? How does a friar work?
Yeah, I think like most people, and it's going to be different from friar to friar as well, is there's a very kind of individualistic way of how we get things that we need to get done. We have a friar here who we refer to his method of work, which is doing a little bit throughout the day, 15-minute chunks here and there, and he approaches things like mopping this way as well. So you when you live in the context of him mopping a floor in 15-minute chunks over the course of a day, you see the mop bucket kind of progress down the hallway. And it's like, can he just do this all at once? But it's, you know, everybody's a little bit different in that sense, to say. And so it's I think, you know, similarly, work looks a lot like most people. I think the main difference is that we do stop and pause. I acknowledge that my work is maybe a little bit more churchy than most people's work, and so that makes it a little bit easier to pause and you know, and pray, and maybe it's a vocal prayer like the Our Father or the Lord's Prayer, and just to kind of place myself back into God's presence. It's again that recognition that I'm not by myself in my office. I'm not by myself, you know, at my desk. That God's with me there too. That He's directing my work. That the Holy Spirit is directing the trajectory of the goals and things that I want to accomplish. And again, that's a very, very helpful reminder in those moments of stress of, you know, when you know, when you got to cut to the chase and you got to hit hit the deadline, that God's with me in that, and that He's stronger than me, and that He is He's able to compensate for my inadequacies, even in this. And again, it takes the pressure off. And so I'm very fortunate to be able to, when that bell rings at 4:40 in the afternoon, to say, this is important. God's called me to do this work. There's something that there's some good fruit that will come of this, but it's time for something else now. And to be able to, and it's not, some days it's easier than others, because you get into your work. I like my work. Sometimes I'd rather do my work than go to prayer. And other times I'd rather do nothing than do my work. So it's, or pray, so there's a sense in which that idea of God being with you is very important to how I work.
I just thought when you were talking, I thought about, sometimes you may be wanting to work and you have to go to prayer, or sometimes you don't want to work and it's time to work. And there's kind of a detachment in that, and being faithful to what is being asked of you in the moment. Tell me a little bit more about detachment, or how you understand detachment or letting go. Like, why does that matter? Why is that important? Are there examples in your life that you can think of that help unpack that?
I think the things that we consider to be very important, they're very personal. There may be a lot of baggage behind why they're important to us. There may be a lot of good things of why they're important to us. But it's a very sort of self-centered orientation to those various things, whether they be good, they be a good habit, or they be my family, or they be my good relationships, my friends, and they're all also maybe those bad habits, those things that those crutches that I use to kind of to get me through a difficult time that maybe aren't healthy for me. Kind of those all of those things. We even call some of these things like self-care. So they're very self-oriented, and I think we can put too much importance on ourselves. We can think of ourselves kind of as the center of the universe, and in order for me to get this job done, I need to be able to, to take a vacation, 3 times a year, or go to somewhere beautiful and to detox or something like that, or I may need to have a drink at the end of the day. We can have this attitude about this is for me, this is for myself, to care for myself, and so that I can kind of let off a little bit of steam. I can undo the pressure a little bit, and I think detachment, the practice of detachment generally in your life, is the realization that that steam, that pressure isn't maybe all that real. In the scheme of what God is doing and what He's capable of, and it's something that I'm actually maybe fabricating in myself. My attachments are the things that are causing pressure. My attachment to doing this thing every day is causing a conflict with this other thing that maybe God has actually called me to. And so I have to, the challenge is always going to be, well, I don't want to get rid of that. That's why it's an attachment, right? I don't want to get rid of that because I'm somehow using it. I need that to get through. I need that to kind of let off the steam, when, honestly, a lot of times it's the attachments that are causing the pressure to build. And so it's that freedom from all of these things that may be good in and of themselves, by themselves, but maybe in the context of what God is asking for you to do are very little. And we're making them bigger than they actually are. Are
there any examples that, to the extent you feel comfortable sharing from your journey of life, for now, etc., that you've feel like God has invited you to shed or let go of? And...
Yeah.
Or even something from the past.
For a long time, for a long portion of my life, and for even a big portion of kind of the beginning stages of my journey here, I was very attached to certain relationships, friendships, and I was deathly afraid of losing certain relationships or those relationships changing, which is ridiculous in the context of entering a monastery, because those people aren't in the monastery, right? Those friendships, those relationships are elsewhere, and they're going to move on their own. But I was afraid. There was a great fear in me of losing those people who meant a lot to me, who I loved. And so there was kind of a grasping after, keeping up communication, maybe beyond what was appropriate for someone who's living in a monastery. We should be a little bit more detached from people outside the monastery. So texting too much, or maybe wanting to kind of meet up with different friendships or people who were coming into town or whatever it may be. And I think that was something that was causing a pressure to build in me, those attachments to those relationships, when in fact God was giving me a whole community to live with, and he was giving me himself as a friend. And so my grasping hold of those former relationships and that had a former great importance to me was causing a tension to unfold in my relationships within religious life, or my relationship with God in prayer, because I was constantly distracted by those people and their lives, and maybe the good happy memories too of those people.
What reflections and advice or guidance would you have for people that, family situation or some other community situation? What advice would you have for like prioritizing the relationships in your life? How to think about that ordering of relationships.
I feel like I'm going back to Saint Teresa a lot, but she kind of is the author of the instruction manual of my soul in some way. At least I feel that way. But she says she was very insistent in her communities and her monasteries that there be few. She was forming nuns, right? Communities of nuns. And she was very insistent there be few nuns. And the reason why was because she wanted there to be an intentionality of love in the midst of that monastery. And so if there were too many, well, she had lived in a monastery with too many, before, in her life. She had lived with 150 other women at one point. And she recognized that, when there's so many, what's going to naturally happen is you're going to have cliques form, and there's going to be, things like that happen. And so to kind of bring that into the world, that her realization of keeping the community small is to keep your community somewhat small and limit it to the people that God has put into your life at this particular moment. And that was a big realization for me, because I was having friends who were moving, who were starting families, who were very far away in some cases, and I was trying to kind of include them into my monastery, and that wasn't good, because I wasn't being present to the people that were actually present. And so I think the priorities in relationship should be the people that God is putting into your life, and to make some discernment about that, and to discern how big too that circle of influence ought to be. And so with prioritizing relationships, God calls us to love everybody, but I think he calls us individually and intentionally to love specific people, more, or more intentionally. And I think that kind of monastic sort of example from Saint Teresa and her realization of keeping the community small is helpful. Keep your community small in that sense, and discern that, both in number and the identities of those people.
keeping your community small and being present to loving those that are closest to you or God's put in your life, that can often be sometimes in my experience and other people I've known, can be hardest to love the people that are closest to you.
Yeah.
And you see all the time, what is it, the expression, familiarity breeds contempt,
Mm-hmm.
which isn't always true, but it can be in some
Right.
cases. How do you deal with that? How do you really stay focused on being present to and loving those when it's really difficult, or there may be challenges, frictions, animosities, grudges, resentment in the midst of it?
I think it's important to remember that love isn't a feeling. And when we try to expect it to be a feeling, we're going to measure our love based on feelings. And feelings are important. God created us with feelings, and they can be helpful to help us to kind of gauge, various things, where we are, where other people are. And but if we're constantly living our life kind of chasing feelings, then that's going to damage a lot of relationships, just because relationships aren't always easy and relationships don't always feel good. And I think that's why it's always helpful to remember that God is intentional about even the people He puts in our life, in a more intense way, whether it be our family, our coworkers, kind of our more immediate sort of circle of influence, I guess you could say. I think God picks those people intentionally as a way to say, here are the people that I'm calling you to love. And it's not to say that there's not going to be someone on the street that you encounter in a moment that God isn't asking you to love them too. But I think when our Lord speaks about the neighbor, loving your neighbor, He means everyone who comes into proximity with you. Think of like the story of the Good Samaritan, who encountered the man who encounters the Samaritan on the side of the road doesn't know who he is. In fact, he represents someone who is an enemy to his people in a sense. And yet we ought to love our enemies. We ought to love this person that I have no idea what their story is, what their context is. But I think also we have to, God's calling us to love more specifically the people who He's placed in our lives to be with, Mm-hmm. And you don't have to think hard about that, because it's the people who are already there. It's the people you're already spending time with. It's the people who are already have some importance with respect to maybe your work or your friend circle of friends or your family. Most importantly, your family. And just to say that you don't have to think very hard about who to love, and so by restricting kind of the who in that question, when it gets tough, that can help us to remember that, well, God's calling me to dig a little deeper here, and to maybe move past my animosity in this moment towards this person, and I don't think you can have that realization or that introspection without taking time to pray, because I think God reveals a lot of that to us in those moments. If you're very busy all the time, it's going to be very easy to turn your back on the people who are driving you crazy. But if you're praying a little bit, then those relationships will benefit in the long run, just because you've taken the moment to be with God and to realize that God has put that person in your life.
Go back to the detachment question for a little bit. Do you have any practical advice for people that maybe, we all have various addictions and attachments. It's part of humanity. It's part of it's part of the reality of existing in this world. And we all have opportunity to grow in curbing those addictions, releasing things that are attaching us, that are holding us back from ourselves, from others, from love, from God. Could you give some practical advice to me even in how to recognize those and start to let go of those? What would you say?
Yeah, I think the a good identification method for addictions are to imagine the various things in your life, whether they be habits, whether they be kind of those let off steam sort of methods or things that are kind of the things you turn to in moments of anxiety and stress to kind of the self-medications, I guess, be the best way to put it. The way to identify the self-medications is to identify the anxiety that maybe bubbles up when you try to stop doing it, right? And so that's a good sign of something that is maybe more on the addictive side of things. Is that kind of that's why sometimes those negative feelings can be very good and important, because they can help us to identify something that's going underlying the issue. And then the second step would be to not be afraid of what might happen or what might change as a result of doing away with something, or or detaching yourself from something, or seeking to maybe fight against an addiction or the temptations towards an addiction. Not be afraid, and also understand that you're not alone. Understand that you have built up a lot of these self-medication sort of behaviors over the course of a lifetime, that they take some time. And ultimately, I think some people often ask, why does God permit sin or addiction or sometimes some of these things? And it's not that he wills them, or he says, okay, this person's going to be addicted to some drug for the majority of their life. That's not how God is. However, he's always the one who is trying to transform and to try to make some good, even out of difficult or bad situations. I've said it several times, even today, God likes to do a lot with a little. He likes to transform. And so in the midst of your hurt, your anxiety, your temptations, your addictions, God might be using this thing as a way to help you to understand that you are not strong enough and that you need him. And sometimes we're very pig-headed with respect to wanting to do things ourselves and wanting to, I just have to get over this, or I just have to white knuckle it through this temptation to get to the other side. And God doesn't want that either. He doesn't want us to be enslaved to our addictions, but he also doesn't want us to be white knuckling it through things, thinking that it's all on us, and that if we don't make it through, that we're a failure or that we failed. I think the purpose and the reason why God permits these things to happen to us is so that we can realize how much we need him, and how much we need that relationship, and how much he desires for us to depend on him and to be that shoulder, to be that crutch, not the self-medication, but him. He wants to replace those things. He wants to be the thing at the end of the day that you plop down on the couch, and instead of cracking open a beer, you plop down on the couch and say, God, I'm here.